Let me take you back 2,000 years ago to a moment that changed everything we know about faith, sacrifice, and redemption. Picture this scene where Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, stands at a crossroads between loyalty and 30 pieces of silver. And imagine if he chose differently. We all know the story that is echoed through centuries, where Judas walked into the Garden of Gethsemane with soldiers behind him and identified Jesus with a kiss that became the most infamous act of betrayal in human history. But what if that kiss never happened? What if Judas decided to stay faithful to his teacher and friend instead of handing him over to the authorities who wanted Jesus silenced? Think about how the entire timeline would shift if Judas kept his doubts to himself, or maybe talked them through with Jesus like Peter did when he had his moments of weakness. Without Judas leading the temple guards to Jesus that night, the arrest would have been much more complicated, because the authorities needed someone from the inner circle to identify Jesus among the crowds during Passover, when Jerusalem was packed with pilgrims. Jesus might have continued his ministry longer, walking through villages and teaching in synagogues while more people heard his message about love, forgiveness, and the kingdom of God. The movement could have grown even larger before the inevitable confrontation with religious and Roman authorities, because let me be honest, Jesus was challenging too many powerful structures to avoid conflict forever. The Jewish leaders who saw Jesus as a threat to their authority, and the Romans who feared any talk of kingdoms, would have eventually found another way to capture him. Maybe they would have arrested him publicly during one of his teachings in the temple courts, or waited until he traveled to a smaller town where crowds were thinner and his followers fewer in number. Without the betrayal narrative, the story of salvation would carry a different emotional weight, because Judas represents something deeply human in all of us, that capacity for failure and the struggle between what we know is right and what seems easier or more beneficial in the moment. If Judas remained loyal, we would lose one of the most powerful examples of how even those closest to grace can fall, and how devastating the consequences of our choices can be. The other disciples might have faced different trials, because with Judas staying faithful, perhaps all 12 would have been present during the crucifixion instead of scattering in fear. Their unity could have made them bolder, or it could have put more of them in danger when the authorities came for Jesus, because being associated with a condemned man was risky business in those days. Peter still would have denied Jesus 3 times according to the prophecy Jesus made. But imagine if Judas was there to witness it and remained faithful himself, creating this powerful contrast between different types of failure and redemption. We would see how one disciple fell and returned while another stood firm through the darkest hours. The early church would have been built on a foundation that included all 12 original disciples, instead of needing to replace Judas with Matthias after Jesus ascended to heaven. Judas could have been one of the pillars spreading the gospel message across different regions, and we might have epistles or letters from Judas in our New Testament, sharing his unique perspective on walking with Jesus. Maybe Judas would have been the one sent to the Jewish community, since he understood their concerns and questions better than most. Or perhaps he would have traveled to distant lands carrying the message of hope and transformation. His testimony about staying faithful when temptation came would inspire countless believers facing their own moments of testing and doubt. The theological understanding of sacrifice might have developed differently too, because the betrayal by a close friend added layers of meaning to the crucifixion about how Jesus suffered not just physical pain, but emotional abandonment. Without that element, we would focus more on the willing sacrifice Jesus made and less on the human instruments that brought it about. Churches would tell stories differently on Palm Sunday and during Holy Week, when we remember the final days of Jesus on earth, because instead of the tragic fall of Judas, we would celebrate the faithfulness of all 12 disciples who stayed true even when everything seemed lost and their hopes appeared crushed. The name Judas would carry no stigma, and parents would name their children after him without hesitation, just like they named them Peter or John or Matthew today. He would be venerated as a saint, and his feast day would be celebrated with joy, rather than his name being synonymous with betrayal and treachery. However, we must also consider that the betrayal might have been necessary for the prophecies to be fulfilled and for the salvation story to unfold exactly as God intended it. Sometimes I wonder if Judas was playing a predetermined role in a cosmic drama where every act mattered for the final redemption of humanity. If the crucifixion happened through different circumstances, would the resurrection carry the same power, and would the message of forgiveness reach as deeply into human hearts when we understand that Jesus forgave even those who betrayed him most intimately? The story as it happened shows us that no sin is beyond redemption, and no betrayal too great for grace to cover. While imagining a world where Judas never betrayed Jesus opens fascinating possibilities about how Christianity might have developed differently, the story we have carries profound truths about human nature, divine purpose, and redemptive love. The betrayal became a mirror showing us our own capacity for both failure and forgiveness, reminding us that even in our darkest choices, we remain within reach of grace. Perhaps the real question is not what would have happened if Judas stayed faithful, but what we learn about ourselves and God through the story that actually unfolded, where even the worst betrayal could not stop the greatest act of love the world has ever known.